So over the last few weeks, we've been looking at stories where people have gotten kicked off of a cruise ship for certain violations. We looked at a man who got kicked off a cruise ship for arguing with the staff. We looked at a smoker who got kicked off a cruise ship for flicking a cigarette butt overboard. And we talked about people who got kicked off the cruise ship for missing the muster drill. Throughout this video, I am going to leave links to the other getting kicked off of a cruise ship videos. You'll see a little eye in the upper right hand side of your screen. On most devices, click that and you can see those other videos. We're gonna keep that series going today. We're gonna talk about the couple that got kicked off a cruise ship for not having the right travel documentation. Hey, what's up everybody? Tony with Lido, Loca. Welcome to the YouTube channel. If you're brand new here and you enjoy cruising, consider subscribing with the notification bell on. Now on to today's story. The last thing that you want to happen to you when you're cruising is to be kicked off the cruise ship. One of the biggest pieces of advice that we give when people ask us what our #1 cruise tip is, it is have your travel documentation in order prior to cruising. It sounds simple enough, but time after time you find people that didn't do the due diligence to find out exactly what travel documentation they needed, and then they had trouble on their cruise day. Now most of the trouble that you hear about is people who have challenges when they get to the cruise port for not having the correct documentation. But the story that I have today are people who actually made it on the cruise ship and then got kicked off because of travel documentation. To be honest, a lot of cruising that happens in the United States, especially cruising from Florida down to the Caribbean, the requirements for travel documentation are not that complex. Most of those cruises are closed loop itineraries, and what closed loop means is the cruise ship leaves from one US city, it goes to a foreign port of call and returns to the same US city. In those circumstances, the only ID you really need is a state issued ID and your birth certificate. You can make that cruise all day long without any extra expense, probably using the documentation that you already have. We do advocate having a passport. The major reason for that is if on your closed loop travel you happen to get put off at a cruise port and you can't get back on the cruise ship, you were late, you missed the ship, then you will have to fly home. You can't do that with just your birth certificate and ID. You'd have to go to the local embassy and apply for a temporary passport so that you can fly home. We do recommend that you get a passport, but again, for the most part, doing closed loop travel, the documentation is not that expensive. Now, when you start to travel other places, to other countries, when you travel to Europe, when you travel to Asia, you're going to need a more extensive set of travel documentation. And when you go to Asia, you need a travel visa. And what a visa is it is a document that is issued to you by the country that you're going to that says you're allowed to be in that country, you're allowed entry and exit into that country for a particular reason. For example, I'm going to Asia in September. I'm applying for a 10-year Chinese visa. And so that's in addition to my passport. Part of the process there is I have to fill out an application explaining why I'm going to China. I actually have to send the Chinese consulate my passport, and they have to decide whether or not I'm allowed entry and exit into China, and they will put a visa into my passport that will allow me entry and exit. China is one of those countries that is super strict, and that brings us to the story of the couple who got kicked off the cruise ship after they were on the cruise ship because of travel documentation. This was an elderly couple, a 71-year-old man, William Coates from the United States, and his wife. They embarked on a 14-day journey. They boarded in Yokohama, Japan, with the goal of going to South Korea and to China. Now, a couple days into their cruise, they were called by customer service and notified that since they did not have the proper visa to get into China, they would be put off the cruise ship in Korea. It seems a little harsh, but the way China works is that if everybody on board does not have the proper documentation, they will fine the ship extra money and they may possibly not let anybody get off the cruise ship. So this was a Holland America cruise line ship. The choice they had to make was to not allow anybody to get off the cruise ship because of this couple, or they had to make the decision to actually put this couple off before they got to China. And that's what they decided to do. They put this 71-year-old gentleman and his wife off the cruise ship in Busan, Korea, and it was on them to get home. This is the other thing that we keep reiterating in this series. If you are put off for some sort of violation, it's going to be on you to try to get home. The couple spent $2,400 to fly home, and they got very little compensation from the cruise line. The cruise line did give them a token refund of some of their airfare, but the cruise line stance was they had violated the cruise rules. That's why they got put off, and therefore they weren't going to get refunded. So you may be listening to this story thinking, how did the cruise line allow these people to get on the cruise ship originally without the proper documentation? That is the key point here. It is your responsibility to understand what documentation you need for the ports that you are visiting. To the cruise line's credit, they did include in the original emails this requirement for the Chinese visa. They reached out to the couple several times before they cruised through email and reminded them that they needed the Chinese visa. So the cruise line, they will let you know what you need, but the onus is on you. It is really up to you whenever you travel to understand exactly what your travel documentation is. That's probably why we give it as the #1 tip, because we want you guys to be thinking about, what do I need to travel? It's a lot different than just going from state to state here in the United States. It's a lot different than going to the Caribbean. Once you branch out to Europe, once you branch out to Asia, you need to start looking at what documentation you need before you get on the cruise ship. And it does come back to that pesky cruise contract. In Holland America's cruise contract, and I'm sure in others, there is language in there that says it is on the guest to make sure that they have the proper travel documentation. My understanding is the cruise lines did plead with the Chinese immigration to make an exception for this case, and they were told no. And so seemingly the cruise line didn't have a choice but to put these people off the cruise ship. Maybe they could have done more to help them get home, but again, the responsibility is on the traveler. I do want to mention that one exception in the Caribbean, and it's not so prevalent today because of some things that have happened over the last couple months, is that when you travel to Cuba, you are required to obtain a visa to get in and out of the country. We went to Cuba on one of Carnival's first sailings back in September of 2017, and the cool thing is the cruise line took care of most of that process. The night before we got into Havana, they provided us with the documentation, the visa documentation, very clear instructions on how to fill them out. They charged us for the visa on our shipboard account, and so it was a fairly seamless process. The only thing we had to do is make sure that we filled out those visas and returned them in a timely fashion, and that we followed the instructions. So Cuba is an exception. Right now, no cruises going to Cuba, so not a big deal. But again, most of the rest of the Caribbean, you can go in and out with just your state-issued ID and a birth certificate, but I would advocate that you get a passport. My question for you is this: have you ever had any challenges with the travel documentation? Have you ever forgot your documentation? Leave your travel documentation story in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button. This is Tony from Lido, Loca. I've got some more cruise videos popping up. Check those out. And until the next time, I'll see you on the Lido. Bye.